The earth shook, not an earthquake, not a natural disaster, but God was angry. He struck the ocean floor with his trident, and the entire coastline of Greece trembled. Cities cracked, harbors flooded, mountains split, as if made of paper. He didn't do this because he was at war. He didn't do this because civilization was in danger. He did this because he lost a contest. He is Poseidon, god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses, ruler of 70% of the earth's surface, brother of Zeus, who nearly became king of the gods, and he is the most fickle, the most unpredictable, the most destructive force in all of Greek mythology. He doesn't just rule the ocean, he is the ocean itself, in all its beauty, all its bounty, and all its terrifying, indiscriminate, destructive power. Stay with me, because the myths about Poseidon are unlike anything else in Greek mythology, and every single one of them will take your breath away. Let's take a closer look at who Poseidon really was, for his power and domain were far more extensive than many imagine. Poseidon is one of the three supreme rulers of the universe. He was the son of the Titans Cronus and Rhea, and the brother of Zeus, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia. When the three brothers cast lots to divide the universe after defeating the Titans, Poseidon received the sea, every ocean, every river, every lake, every body of water on earth. He was also given power over earthquakes. The ancient Greeks called him Earth Shaker, a title that appeared in ancient texts as often as his real name. When the earth trembled, when rocks collapsed into the sea, when harbors were destroyed overnight, it was Poseidon, operating in his domain beneath the surface of the world. And he was the god of horses, which at first glance seems completely unrelated to the sea. But in ancient Greek understanding, horses and the sea shared one fundamental quality. Both were immensely powerful and could either serve humanity magnificently or destroy it utterly, depending on how well they were understood and respected. His home was an underwater palace of breathtaking splendor. Ancient sources described it as built of gold, coral, and precious stones, surrounded by sea creatures of every kind, located in the deepest part of the Aegean Sea. I was in the Aegean Sea last weekend. Believe me, it's perfection and paradise on earth. Emerging from this palace, he drove a chariot drawn by enormous divine horses, whose hooves glided across the surface of the water, and the sea calmed before him while the denizens of the deep rose to see their king off. He carried a trident, a three-pronged divine weapon that was his symbol and primary instrument. With it, he could shatter rocks, calm or raise storms, create springs of water from dry land, and shake the very foundations of the world. He was majestic, powerful, and deeply, dangerously temperamental, and his myths reflect each of these qualities. We touched on this story in our episode about Athena, but from Poseidon's perspective, it tells a completely different and more revealing tale. Poseidon wanted Athens, the majestic Acropolis, towering over Greece's most strategically important city. He wanted to make it his city, his place of worship, his monument to divine power in the mortal world. He struck the rock with his trident with all the force of his divine power. The rock split. A spring of salt water gushed from the crack, and from the swirling water emerged a magnificent horse, its mane flowing and its hooves striking sparks from the stone. Now I wondered why the Athenians needed salt water. What do you think? It was a display of extraordinary, overwhelming power. The entire assembled crowd gasped. The people gathered to judge the contest were clearly impressed, and then Athena planted the seed, and she grew an olive tree. The judges chose the olive tree. They chose Athena. Poseidon's reaction to this defeat is one of the most revealing moments in his entire mythology. He did not accept the verdict favorably. He did not acknowledge that perhaps the practical value of an olive tree outweighed the dramatic impact of a spring of salt water and a divine horse. He flooded the entire Attic plain. He was offended, not a metaphorical flood, not a symbolic expression of discontent. He called down the waters of the sea upon the land of Athens and completely inundated it, destroying crops, destroying buildings, killing livestock, devastating the region that had just chosen his rival in his place. The gods were forced to intervene directly to stop the flood, and Poseidon, finally restrained, withdrew his waters, but never forgot. Throughout Greek mythological tradition, Poseidon's relationship with Athens remained one of barely restrained hostility. The city that rejected him never fully emerged from his shadow. It seems Poseidon harbored a grudge, This story tells you everything essential about Poseidon. He was capable of extraordinary gifts. The horse he created on the Acropolis was one of the most magnificent creations ever made by a god, and he was capable of using that same power to devastate and destroy when his pride was wounded. The line between Poseidon's generosity and his wrath was thin, and crossing it had consequences. Here's a story that most people who consider themselves experts in Greek mythology have never heard, and it explains, better than anything else, why the Trojan War occurred and why Poseidon sided with the side he did. Long before the famous war between Greece and Troy, before Paris captured Helen, before thousands of ships set sail, Poseidon and Apollo were punished by Zeus for rebelling on Olympus. The specific details of the rebellion vary depending on the ancient source, but the punishment was the same in all versions. Both gods were temporarily stripped of their divine status and sent to serve the mortal king of Troy, Laomedon. While serving in the mortal realms, Poseidon and Apollo built the walls of Troy. No ordinary walls. Divine walls built by the two most powerful craftsmen and builders among the gods, constructed to be impregnable to make Troy the most fortified city in the known world. Walls that, as the famous saying goes, would make Troy invincible. When the walls were completed, Laomedon refused to pay them. He refused to pay the gods for the work they performed as his servants. Poseidon's response was immediate and devastating. He sent a sea monster, a creature of enormous size and terrifying strength, to ravage the coast of Troy. It regularly emerged from the waters to kidnap people, destroy fishing fleets, and ravage coastal settlements dependent on the sea. The Trojans, in despair, received a prophecy. The sea monster would only be satisfied by the sacrifice of the king's own daughter, Hesione, chained to a rock on the shore. Hercules, passing by during one of his adventures, offered to kill the monster. For a fee, it's ridiculous that Hercules was just strolling by. Laomedon agreed. Hercules killed the monster, and Laomedon again refused to pay. A real eccentric. This man twice refused to pay the gods and once to Hercules. The Trojans seemed to have an uncanny knack for making the worst possible decisions about who not to pay. Hercules eventually returned to sack Troy, long before the famous war, and Poseidon's hatred for the city was firmly entrenched. When the Trojan War began, Poseidon sided with the Greeks not out of any particular love for them, but out of a hatred for Troy that had been building since the day Laomedon counted his coins and decided that divine labor did not require divine reward. The walls that Poseidon built to protect Troy ultimately failed to protect it from Poseidon himself. Of all the aspects of Poseidon's mythology, perhaps none reveals his nature as fully as the extraordinary creatures associated with his realm. The sea in ancient Greek mythology was more than just a vast body of water. It was a living, active, and dangerous realm filled with creatures that defied the categories of the ordinary world. And the ruler of all these creatures, directly responsible for many of them, was Poseidon. The Cretan bull was one of his most significant creations. Poseidon sent it as a gift to King Minos of Crete, a magnificent white bull of supernatural beauty, in the hope that Minos would sacrifice it to him. Minos, dazzled by the animal's perfection, replaced it with a lesser bull. Poseidon's punishment for this substitution set in motion one of the most extraordinary chains of consequences in all of mythology. He drove Minos' wife, Pasiphae, into an obsessive, all-consuming love for a bull, a love so intense that it resulted in the birth of the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature whose creation ultimately required the construction of the labyrinth and the sacrifice of Athenian youth, as well as Theseus's heroic expedition to end his reign of terror. One replaced the sacrifice, the other refused the divine offering, and the consequences rippled across generations, spawning monsters, demanding heroes, consuming lives across the Aegean world. Then came the monsters of the straits that Odysseus had to pass through on his journey home from Troy, Scylla and Charybdis. Ancient sources are unclear as to which was Poseidon's direct creation, but both lived within his domain, operated under his supreme authority, and served as expressions of the sea's fundamental indifference to human survival. Scylla was a six-headed monster that snatched sailors straight from their ships, dragging them to its many jaws before their companions could react. Charybdis was a whirlpool that swallowed the entire sea. 3 times a day, creating a vortex capable of engulfing entire ships in seconds. Between these two terrors, Odysseus had to choose his path, losing 6 men to Scylla's heads and narrowly escaping Charybdis's total destruction. The Sea of Poseidon was not a neutral transit route. It was a living ordeal, testing every sailor who crossed it with trials that could end their lives in seconds. Of all Poseidon's feuds, and there were many, none lasted longer or caused more suffering than his conflict with Odysseus. It began with an act Odysseus committed not against Poseidon, but against Poseidon's son. Polyphemus was a cyclops, a one-eyed giant who lived on an island with his flock of sheep, isolated from the other Cyclops and subservient to no one. He was also Poseidon's son. When Odysseus and his men landed on the island and found themselves trapped in Polyphemus's cave, Odysseus, using his renowned cunning, escaped. He plied the Cyclops with wine. He blinded him with a sharpened stake driven through his one eye. He then hid under the bellies of the sheep while the blinded giant groped for the men at the cave entrance. It was a masterpiece of quick reaction in a critical situation, one of the most famous examples of Odysseus's cunning in all of Greek literature. And then Odysseus made a mistake that cost him 10 years of his life. As his ship sailed away from the island, Odysseus, unable to resist, called out to the blinded Cyclops. He revealed his true identity. He mocked Polyphemus, saying that Odysseus of Ithaca had blinded him. Why do such a thing? In agony, Polyphemus prayed to his father Poseidon. He asked for one specific divine intervention, that Odysseus never reach home, or, if he must return home, that he arrive late, alone on a strange ship, and that disaster await him. Poseidon heard. For 10 years, while Odysseus was supposed to sail home from Troy, a journey that should have taken several weeks, Poseidon pursued him. He summoned storms. He destroyed ships. He drove him to the most remote and dangerous corners of the ancient world. Every time Odysseus came within reach of home, Poseidon found a way to push him further away. Eventually, the gods intervened on Odysseus's behalf. While Poseidon was away visiting the Ethiopians at the ends of the earth, they organized his final journey home. But even then, Poseidon managed to punish him one last time, turning the Phaeacian ship on which Odysseus was sailing home to stone. 10 years of divine persecution. Because Odysseus couldn't resist a fleeting moment of pride, Poseidon never forgot. Poseidon never forgave. Let's move on to one of the most beautiful and instructive myths associated with Poseidon, the story of how he created the horse. In the most ancient versions of this myth, Poseidon created the horse entirely from the sea itself. By striking a wave with his trident, and from the foam and force of this blow, the first horse emerged. Here's a slight digression from me personally. Why would the ruler of the sea need a horse? Where did he intend to ride it? Majestic, powerful, wild, and utterly unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Other versions connect the horse's creation to his contest with Athena. The horse he created for the Acropolis was the first of its kind, emerging from the rock he struck with his trident. In any case, the connection between Poseidon and horses is one of the oldest and most enduring elements of his mythology, and this is not as surprising as it might seem at first glance. Horses and the sea share fundamental qualities in the ancient Greek imagination. Both are forces of immense power that can be harnessed to satisfy human ambition, carrying riders on land, ships on water, but which remain at their core wild and potentially deadly. A horse that unseats its rider can kill. A sea that turns against a sailor can destroy an entire fleet. Poseidon was the master of both, because both embodied the same fundamental truth about power. It is always, ultimately, greater than the men who try to wield it. A horse does not belong to its rider. The sea does not belong to the sailors who cross it. They belong to Poseidon, and they move at his will. Ancient Greek sailors prayed to Poseidon before every voyage. Ancient Greek warriors prayed to him before cavalry battles. Both understood, in different ways, that they were dealing with forces they didn't fully control, and that the only way to survive was to acknowledge this and show due respect. The horse, the sea, and the earthquake beneath them. Everything was Poseidon. Everything was unpredictable. Everything was magnificent. Poseidon was a warrior of the highest rank, and his participation in the great cosmic conflicts of Greek mythology reveals a side of his character sometimes obscured by his connection to the sea. In the Titan-Namakhi, the 10-year war between the Olympians and the Titans, Poseidon fought alongside his brother Zeus against the ancient powers that ruled before them. Armed with his trident, it was one of the three principal weapons of the Olympian forces, along with Zeus's thunderbolt and Hades' helmet of invisibility. Ancient sources describe Poseidon's use of his trident not only as a weapon against individual opponents, but also as a tool for altering the battlefield itself, splitting the earth, changing river courses, flooding lowlands to block the Titan's escape routes, and harnessing the fundamental powers of his realm to give the Olympians strategic advantages that could not be achieved through martial might alone. This is Poseidon at his most sophisticated, not just the most powerful force on the battlefield, but also the most geographically significant. He didn't simply fight in war, he changed the landscape of war. In the Gigantomachy, the later war against the giants, sent by Gaia to challenge the Olympian order, Poseidon's most celebrated achievement was his victory over the giant polybotes. He pursued polybotes across the sea, a god pursuing a giant through his own domain, an almost unfair advantage, and when he overtook him, he broke off a piece of the island of Kos and hurled it at the giant, burying him beneath the entire island, which, according to some ancient legends, became the island of Nisiros. He defeated his enemy not with weapons, he defeated him with geography. This is the fullest expression of Poseidon's power, not just the blow of his trident, the raising of a storm, or an earthquake, but the ability to use the physical world itself as a weapon, to reshape the landscape, to transform the earth itself into an instrument of divine will. Let's explore those corners of Poseidon mythology that most retellings completely bypass because some of his strangest stories are also the most revealing. The story of Theseus and the Golden Crown is one of the most extraordinary divine interventions in all of Greek mythology. Theseus, a great Athenian hero, son of Aegeus and, according to some traditions, also the son of Poseidon himself, was sailing to Crete with young Athenians destined for the Minotaur. Also on board was a Cretan king named Minos. A clash ensued. Minos, demonstrating his divine connections, prayed to Zeus and received a thunderbolt in response. He then challenged Theseus to prove his divine origin. Minos threw the golden crown into the sea. He told Theseus to retrieve it, implying that if Poseidon truly was his father, the sea would do him no harm. Theseus dove. Ancient sources describe what happened next with extraordinary vividness. Dolphins accompanied him down into the depths. Nereids, divine sea maidens, surrounded him with light. And at the bottom of the sea, in Poseidon's own palace of gold, coral, and precious stones, Amphitrite herself, Poseidon's queen, placed a crown on Theseus's head and wrapped a purple mantle around his shoulders. He returned to the surface bearing not only the golden crown thrown by Minos, but also Amphitrite's crown, as well as proof of his divine origin. Written in the very fact of his survival, Poseidon claimed his son in the most impressive way possible. Then comes the creation of Pegasus, the winged horse whose history connects Poseidon with one of the most beloved creatures in all of mythology. When Perseus cut off Medusa's head, two extraordinary creatures emerged from her blood: Chrysaor, a golden giant, and Pegasus, a winged horse. Medusa's children by Poseidon were born at the moment of their mother's death. Pegasus subsequently served Bellerophon in his battle against the Chimera, carried the Muses' inspiration to poets throughout the ancient world, and was eventually placed among the stars as a constellation that still bears his name. Poseidon's connection to Medusa, his role as the father of her children, adds another layer of complexity to the already morally complex story we explored in our episode on Athena. Athena punished Medusa for what Poseidon had done. Poseidon, the true transgressor, suffered no divine punishment. And from this injustice emerged Pegasus, one of the most beautiful and beloved creatures in all of mythology. The most beautiful things are sometimes born in the darkest places. Poseidon, more than almost any other god, fully embodies this truth. Poseidon sits in his underwater palace. He was there from the beginning. He will be there at the end. Every wave that has ever crashed on every shore in the history of the world moved according to his will. Every earthquake that has ever split the earth was his trident. He created the horse, the sea monster, and the winged horse born of tragedy. He built the walls that imprisoned Troy, then helped destroy the city they were meant to protect. He pursued Odysseus for 10 years across the Mediterranean because the blinded Cyclops prayed to him from an island cave. He is generous beyond measure and destructive beyond measure. He is the god who brings down entire islands upon his enemies and personally escorts his son through the depths of the sea to prove a point to the Cretan king. He is every sailor's prayer and every sailor's nightmare, the force that carries you and the force that destroys you, the same trident, the same God. The sea makes no distinction between those who deserve to be saved and those who deserve to drown. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't apologize, just like Poseidon. And yet, underneath all this power, beneath all this volatility, pride, and destructive capacity for both creation and destruction, there's something every ancient Greek understood about the sea. It's alive. It responds, remembers, and holds grudges, honors its debts, just like the God who rules it. If this story resonates with you, subscribe. We have a whole series of articles about every god and hero of Greek mythology. Leave a comment. What's the most surprising thing you learned about Poseidon today? See you later. I've got to get ready for the sandy beach of the Aegean Sea.